Hey everyone, welcome back. I was thinking about what we could deep dive into today. And, well, honestly, I was thinking about how much I struggle with breaking bad food habits.
Yeah.
It's just so relatable, isn't it? So I found this blog post that seems perfect for today.
Okay.
It's really honest and personal. It starts with this story about a stressful day at work. And, well, the first thing you reach for is comfort food.
Right.
Curled up on the couch with chips and maybe some ice cream later, just trying to escape the day.
It is a classic scenario, isn't it? And what I find interesting is how the blogger talks about what happens afterward.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just that you feel physically kind of sluggish or bloated.
Right.
There's this emotional layer to it, too, the guilt and shame that can come from those choices.
Yeah, totally. And then there's that social anxiety around food.
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean.
Like suddenly every dinner party becomes this minefield of temptation.
Uh-huh.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
The blogger realized that trying to change everything at once was just setting them up for failure.
Makes sense.
So they decided to focus on just changing one small habit at a time.
That's a really smart approach. Trying to overhaul your entire life overnight just isn't realistic.
Exactly.
Sustainable change is usually about those small adjustments you make bit by bit, and they add up to create a whole new foundation.
Okay, so let's dive into the 7 tips the blogger outlines for actually making those changes.
Sounds good.
The first one is all about figuring out what your triggers are.
Okay.
They kept a food journal for a whole week
Wow.
and wrote down not just what they ate, but how they were feeling at the time.
Interesting. Food journaling can be such a powerful tool. You start to see patterns you wouldn't notice otherwise.
Like what kind of patterns?
Well, like, are you stress eating, eating when you're bored, or maybe even using food as a reward system?
Hmm.
The blogger talks about celebrating a good day with unhealthy treats, which I think a lot of people do.
Yeah, for sure.
Hmm.
But I think what really stood out to me was how they even identified happiness as a trigger.
Oh, wow.
It's so easy to overlook those moments when we're undermining our own progress without even realizing it.
It's true. I think it highlights how important it is to be mindful of why we're making certain food choices.
Right.
Once you understand your triggers, you can come up with strategies to manage them in a healthier way.
Which leads perfectly into tip number 2, finding healthy alternatives.
The classic out with the chips, in with the almonds advice.
Yeah, but the blogger takes it a step further.
Oh, really?
They talk about filling the fridge with colorful veggies, making the healthy choices the most visible and appealing ones.
I love that. It just makes sense.
Right.
It speaks to how much our environment influences our choices.
Uh-huh.
If you surround yourself with healthy options, it becomes that much easier to choose them without even thinking about it.
You're basically setting yourself up for success before you even open the fridge door.
Exactly. It's all about taking away those temptations and replacing them with things that will actually nourish your body.
Tip number 3 is all about mindful eating. The blogger describes sitting down to a meal with no distractions, just focusing on the experience of eating, savoring the flavors and the textures, chewing slowly.
Do you think people underestimate how powerful slowing down can be?
I think so. Our culture is so focused on speed and efficiency that even our meals become rushed.
It's true.
But when you slow down and really pay attention to your food, you're more likely to feel satisfied and less likely to overeat.
Plus, you reconnect with your body's natural hunger cues, which can get totally ignored when you're eating mindlessly.
It's almost like a form of meditation, bringing awareness to each bite.
I like that. A kind of feed meditation.
And that brings us to tip number 4, which is, no surprise, move your body.
Of course, I got to get that exercise in.
But what's interesting is that the blogger isn't just talking about burning calories.
Okay.
They talk about the mood-boosting effects of exercise, which seems really important when you're trying to break unhealthy food habits.
Right, because when we're feeling stressed or down, those cravings for comfort food tends to hit hard.
So exercise isn't just about undoing what we eat. It's about addressing those underlying emotional needs that might be driving our food choices in the first place.
Exactly. And that could be anything from a brisk walk to a yoga class to dancing in your living room, whatever makes you feel good and gets you moving.
I love that.
Yeah.
And speaking of feeling good, tip number 5 is all about self-compassion.
Oh, that's important.
The blogger is really honest about having slip-ups along the way.
Well, we're all human rights.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think too often we have this all-or-nothing mindset when it comes to food.
Yeah, like we set these unrealistic expectations for ourselves and then beat ourselves up when we don't meet them.
It's like I had one cookie, so might as well eat the whole bag.
Exactly. But the blogger's experience shows us that it's okay to have those moments of indulgence.
It happens.
The key is to acknowledge them without judgment and just get back on track.
It's about progress, not perfection.
I like that.
And sometimes we need a little help on that journey, which is where tip number 6 comes in, finding a support system.
Oh, yeah. Sharing your struggles and successes with others can be so powerful.
It makes you feel less alone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It normalizes those struggles, gives you a sense of accountability, and reminds you that you're not the only one going through this.
The blogger talks about joining a support group, but I think support can come from friends, family, even online communities, anywhere you feel safe and understood.
For sure. It's about finding those people who will cheer you on, offer encouragement, and maybe even share some healthy recipes along the way.
And finally, tip number 7 is about celebrating those successes, no matter how small.
Yes. Love that.
The blogger mentions resisting a tempting dessert or fitting into those old jeans and how those things can be incredibly motivating.
Those little wins can make a big difference.
They really do. So often when we focus on what we're doing wrong, that we forget to acknowledge the things we're doing right.
It's true. It's so important to recognize those wins because they reinforce those positive changes and help you stay on track.
Okay, so we've covered the 7 tips, but the blogger makes a really important point.
Yeah.
This isn't a quick fix. This is a journey, not a destination.
I think that's such an important mindset shift.
Totally.
We live in a culture of instant gratification, so it can be frustrating when we don't see results immediately.
It's easy to get discouraged when you're not seeing those big changes right away.
But the blogger shows us that real lasting change happens gradually.
And their current state really shows the power of that long-term perspective.
So.
They talk about enjoying treats mindfully, feeling in control of their choices, feeling confident and energized.
That's great.
That doesn't sound like deprivation to me.
Not at all. It sounds like balance, which is what we're all aiming for, right? Not just a change in our diet, but a change in how we think about food.
A change in our whole relationship with food.
Exactly, one that's built on nourishment, enjoyment, and self-care.
One thing that really stands out to me is how personal this all is.
In what way?
What works for one person might not work for another.
Oh, absolutely. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to healthy eating.
Right.
It's about finding what feels good for your body, what fits into your lifestyle, what you can actually stick with over time.
So it's less about following strict rules and more about figuring out what works for you.
Exactly. It's about listening to your body, experimenting with different things, and finding what feels right for you.
That's such an empowering message. It puts you in control of your own health journey.
It does. It reminds us that we can make choices that support our well-being, both physically and mentally.
So before we jump into part 2 of this deep dive, I'm curious what stood out to you as particularly helpful from these first 7 tips?
That's a great question. Let me think about that for a second.
Was there anything that really resonated with you or gave you a new idea?
You know what? There are a few things, but we'll talk more about that when we come back in just a moment for part 2. We'll be diving even deeper into the blogger's journey and talking about some bigger ideas around behavior change and sustainable well-being. Stay with us. You know what's fascinating? It's how much the blogger's personal experience lines up with what we already know about how people change their behavior.
Interesting.
Like focusing on small changes, first building that self-awareness, and then swapping out those not-so-good habits with positive ones. Those are all things we know help people make real, lasting changes.
It's encouraging to see those ideas actually working in someone's life.
Right.
That makes it feel a lot less like some abstract idea and more like something we can all actually do.
Yeah, exactly.
Of all the things the blogger talked about, the one that really stuck with me was that focus on self-compassion.
Oh, for sure.
We hear so much about discipline and willpower when it comes to healthy eating. But the blogger really highlighted how important it is to forgive yourself and understand that you're human.
It's true. We need to give ourselves permission to mess up sometimes.
We're not perfect.
Exactly. What really matters is what we do after we slip up.
And that's where I think having a good support system is so important.
I agree.
When you have people who get what you're going through, it makes such a difference.
Yeah.
They can give you encouragement and help you stay accountable, especially when you're feeling discouraged.
It's like having your own personal cheer squad for your health journey.
I like that.
But it goes deeper than just cheering. A good support system can also give you practical tips and advice based on what's worked for them.
Right. The blogger talked about joining a support group, but I think support can come from anywhere.
Oh, absolutely.
Friends, family, even online communities. The important thing is finding people who really get it.
Yeah, people who've been there themselves and who can celebrate your successes with you.
Speaking of challenges, the blog post doesn't pretend that this is easy.
No, it definitely doesn't.
It acknowledges that there will be challenges along the way. Did any specific challenge stand out to you in the blogger's story?
Well, I think a lot of people struggle with accepting that change takes time. We live in a world where we want everything right now. So it can be tough when we don't see those results overnight.
Yeah, it's so easy to get discouraged when you don't see a huge transformation right away.
But the blogger's story really shows us that lasting change, the kind that really sticks, happens little by little.
And I think where they are now really speaks to how powerful it can be to take that long-term view.
Oh, I agree.
They talk about enjoying treats, but in a mindful way, feeling like they're in control of their choices, feeling confident and energized.
Wow, that's awesome.
That doesn't sound like someone who's depriving themselves.
Not at all. That sounds like someone who's found a real sense of balance.
Hmm.
And I think that's ultimately what most of us want, right?
Yeah.
Not just changing what we eat, but changing how we feel about food.
Changing our whole relationship with food.
Right. Moving away from that cycle of guilt and feeling restricted and moving towards an approach that feels good and that we can keep up.
You know, something I keep coming back to is how personal this all is.
What do you mean?
There's no one right way to do this. What works for one person might not work for someone else.
Totally agree. There's no magic formula for healthy eating.
So it's not about following some strict set of rules. It's more about figuring out what works for you.
Exactly. It's about paying attention to what your body's telling you, trying different things, and finding what feels right for you.
It's like a journey of self-discovery.
Yeah, I like that.
And that's a really empowering message.
It is. It reminds us that we have the power to make choices that help us feel good, both physically and mentally.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Mm.
what are some of the takeaways that stood out to you the most?
Let me think. There are quite a few, but the biggest one for me is, hold on. The biggest one for me is how inspiring the blogger's journey is. They started out feeling totally overwhelmed and out of control, but by making those small, consistent changes, they found this balance and well-being.
Yeah, it really shows that change is possible for anyone.
Exactly. You don't have to do everything perfectly or all at once.
And it doesn't have to be this huge, overwhelming thing.
Right. The blogger's story is proof that even tiny changes can lead to a big transformation if you keep at it.
And at the end of the day, isn't that what we all want?
I think so.
Not just a different diet, but a different way of thinking about food.
A whole new relationship with food.
Yeah, one that's based on taking care of ourselves, enjoying what we eat, and not feeling guilty all the time.
Moving away from that cycle of restrictions and guilt and towards a way of eating that feels good and that we can actually keep up.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into breaking those unhealthy food habits,
Yeah.
what's one thing you hope people will take away from this?
If I had to pick just one, it would be that everyone has the power to make choices that will help them feel their best.
I love that.
It's about taking charge of your own health and finding what works for you.
No more cookie-cutter diets.
Exactly.
And speaking of taking action,
Mm-hmm.
do you have any advice for our listeners as they start to think about their own journeys towards a healthier relationship with food?
I'd say start small. Don't try to change everything at once. Think of one small change you can make today.
Like what?
Maybe swapping out a sugary drink for water, or adding some extra veggies to your dinner, or going for a quick walk after you eat. Whatever it is, make sure it's something you can actually do. And don't forget to celebrate those small wins along the way.
Because they add up.
Yeah.
Before you know it, those tiny changes become habits, new ways of thinking, and a whole new you.
It really is a journey, not a destination. The important thing is to be patient with yourself. Listen to what your body's telling you and find what feels good and what you can keep up.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful and inspiring. And remember, you have the power to create a healthier, happier relationship with food.
Yes.
Start small, stay consistent, and celebrate every step of the way.